Hello, folks.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Morbid and Unhealthy. And I'm very pleased, very grateful to be able to welcome Mr. Jim Moon to the studio tonight. And for those of you who don't know, there might be a few of you who don't know, he started the Hypnogoria podcast, which is the oldest and longest running horror podcast in the world. Pretty impressive. Welcome, Jim. Do you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Mr. Jim Moon, and so quite by accident, I'm doing one of the longest running horror podcasts. I just don't know when to stop.
When did you start it?
I think it's about to be nearly 14 years ago now, and I kind of started by accident. I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and back then the podcasting landscape was somewhat different. And a lot of shows used to have a feedback section where people could, send in a message or an email, which I started doing. But I soon realized that a lot of them, um, the host preferred if you actually record a little MP3 or a little sound file,
Yeah.
because then they didn't have to read an email. So I started doing that, and I was quite surprised when people said, "Oh, he's got a really good voice," because, like most people, I
Mm.
can't bear the sound of my own voice, especially recorded. It's kind of, oh god, I sound terrible. But that sort of gave me the confidence to kind of think, well, actually, people seem to really enjoy my feedback, and maybe I should give this a go. And there was a little service called Audio Boo, which was free, where you could record, I think, up to 5 minutes, kind of like a little micro podcast. So I started
Mm.
dabbling on that and just doing little readings of poems. And I was quite surprised people were actually listening. And then I thought, oh, well, actually, 5 minutes is a bit limiting. I started doing a couple where they would like do three that in three parts. So you have 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I need to do this properly. And so that's how the first podcast started. Because now I run three, possibly with a fourth to come. But that's sort of how it started, just by feedbacking to other podcasts. And it's kind of podcasting gets a bit infectious, I think, like that.
Oh, definitely infectious. Definitely infectious. I caught it from American Werewolf. So, American Werewolf in New Jersey, whose podcast I'm appearing on tomorrow. But I
Oh,
remember
lovely.
your voice struck me. Oh, thank you. That your voice struck me as having very beautiful, but a very rich quality. It's something in Terry Pratchett about Father Christmas should sound like he pisses rum and craps plum pudding, and
Yes.
that very richness to your voice was quite captivating, but also the subject matter. And just a list here of some of the things that you're covering: the history of universal horror, a commentary club, um, the comedies that you've covered, the Great Library of Dreams, and all those wonderful old stories. And I was, I'm asking this question of everybody: is what was your very first encounter with fictional horror?
well, aside from like fairy stories, and I think everyone was like scared by, say, the witch in Snow White or something like that. The very first proper um, book of ghost stories was one we had in our school library. In the 70s, there was a wonderful writer called Ruth Manning Sanders, and she did these range of books where she retold folk tales from all around the world. And they were all themes. So it was like a book of giants, a book of dragons, a book of princesses, a book of spells, things like this, all with lovely illustrations by a chap called Robin Jacks, who was actually, no, Robin Jakes,
Yeah.
sorry. He was actually related to Hattie Jakes, bizarrely. Um, but the school got the latest one in. It was a book of ghosts and goblins. And that was kind of, oh, like, this is going to be really scary. And there was literally almost like a waiting list to get hold of it. And I still
Yeah.
vividly remember, actually, I think it's probably only a couple of weeks, but I seem to have to wait for years to actually get my hand to be my turn to take it out of the school library. And it did not
Yeah.
disappoint. And particularly, there's a great story about a little girl who's menaced by this skeleton in a haunted house, which rolls its own skull around. And of course, actually, the skeleton,
Ooh.
if you actually stayed and spoke to it, you'd find out you're just wanting to be buried, and it could lead you to treasure, and it all worked out well. But yeah, great stuff. But my first proper sort of grown-up horror story came when I got a copy of Alfred Hitchcock's Ghostly Gallery, an anthology actually edited by Robert Arthur. It's been around since the 70s, and it was reissued by Puffin Books here in the UK in the early 70s. And I got, I was getting quite interested in ghosts, but also I was very scared of them. And I had a book voucher, I think it was Christmas for my birthday, and I thought, if I get a book about ghosts and I know about them, I won't be as scared about them. And I saw Ghostly Gallery, thought, right, I'm having that. As it was, for telling me about ghosts, it was useless. It's all fictional stories, but it had such a great range of stories. The very first one in that book is A.M. Burridge's The Waxwork, and that
Oh God,
completely
yes.
blew my mind. It was kind of wow, I didn't know it could be stories like this, and it's
Mm.
and I was running about probably 7 or 8 when I read that, and it's kind of that launched me on a a lifelong career of acquiring books of strange tales, really.
Yeah. Do you remember the Armado books of great ghost stories?
Oh yes, well that was kind of, I said Ghostly Gallery is the first one I got, and then
Mm.
at the end of our term at our school, there used to be a sports day and a jumble sale. And at this jumble sale, I got hold of the first and second Armada ghost books, and another one, another Puffin book by Kathleen Lynes, The House of the Nightmare and Other Eerie Tales. And I was kind of that. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. I couldn't believe my luck. And in the pages of them, I found so many great stories. That's where I first read R. James and E.F. Benson, and so many just tales have stayed with me ever since. Really.
Yeah. So would you have a favorite author, or would you have a number of favorite authors?
um, I have quite a few, but probably um, the man who's closest to my heart is M.R. James. As
Yeah.
being being just, I remember still to this day being up very late reading by torchlight The Haunted Doll's House, and being
Yeah.
absolutely terrified. Um, but the funny
That's
thing was that literally many years later, I mean, literally only, well, probably last 15, 20 years, something like that, I actually discovered I share the same birthday as M.R. James,
all right.
which I kind of like, I was absolutely stunned to find that. I've been reading him for years, and I knew the year he was born, but I'd never actually seen what, no one had mentioned what day he was born. That's what
Mm.
makes it, because I'd never met anyone who shared my birthdays. And so I kind of, M.R. James, and he, wow.
That is pretty impressive, actually. So that means when it's your birthday, everybody's online celebrating M.R. James's birthday. But I hope you get a rocky
Absolutely. There's
encounter.
a.
Did you have any childhood or adolescent experiences with the supernatural, or is it maybe a thing you don't believe in?
um, well, I'm very much like M.R. James. I will consider anything with the evidence presented to me. And certainly
Yeah,
over the years, I've had a lot of strange experiences. Um, so growing up, I grew up in a little village that was
yeah.
just thick with ghost stories. There was the Grey
Oh,
Lady, who was the local ghost. And it was said if you ran round the local church 7 times at midnight and knocked on the door, she'd appear. Not that
oh.
anyone ever did that,
Did you ever try
to my
it?
knowledge, but but there was lots of
How
stories
big
about
was the
her.
churchyard?
Fairly big actually. if you could be
That's probably why nobody
quite a
did it.
feat. Yeah. It was one of those everyone said
Mm,
we were daring to do it, but then the plan fell down because our parents would not let us out at midnight, so to go and do
ah,
it.
yes, of course.
But no, I had quite a few experiences where I think something ghosty might have been happening when I was growing up. Um,
Mm,
but they're all quite so to say, fairly vague. But the one from I remember from being a child was
yeah.
in my bedroom. We had a spare bed, and one morning I woke up and I was in the other bed. And I remember my parents coming in and they were saying,
Oh.
why have you gone to sleep in that bed? That's not your bed. That's the guest's bed. And I said, well, I didn't move. I went to bed in that bed. And it was always put down I had sleptwalked, but I've never sleptwalked
Mm.
before or since. It's just one of those strange things. Is kind of what was going on there. I'll probably never know.
Yeah, I
But
kind of think having sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
go on. No,
I was just
because I
thinking
said I've
having a
never
spare
sleptwalked
bed
before. Mm.
in the same room as you might immediately remind me of "Oh, whistle and I'll come to you, my lad." So
Well, that's
I
it.
think I'd
Yes,
find it
yeah.
rather nerve-wracking having a spare bed. Maybe if I piled it up with books or something. But so
Well, I remember
do you
I
mind
didn't
telling
like
me what
having
happened?
anything on that bed. I learned not to leave
Mm.
my toys on that bed because when you went to bed, it would look like there was someone on it. And that was a lesson I learned up very
Oh,
early.
what would you say you were quite an anxious child, or just fanciful about the spare bed?
Well, when I was quite young, I did have a really bad phase of having nightmares, like really
Mm.
vivid nightmares. And
Oh, me
now
too.
looking back, yeah, I know it's kind of what I was actually having was lucid dreams because I
Mm.
was actually they were so vivid where I used to wake myself up, but I could still see the nightmare happening, like overlaid. And obviously, when you're like 4 or
Yes.
5, that is terrifying because you're sort of trapped in
Yes.
two worlds. And you always said,
Mm.
well, if you're having a bad dream, if you wake up, it'll stop, and it wouldn't. It did eventually, but
Oh,
you know what I mean. There was that few moments of where you could still see the dream happening, and
yeah.
my poor parents suffered suffered for a while with my night terrors, but it did just subside after a while, thankfully. Um,
Yeah.
and I kind of I think I developed my own sort of little way of sort of putting myself to sleep, and I'd almost like a little mantra or a little prayer saying, "Please don't let me dream. Please don't let me dream." And for years, I
Yeah.
didn't dream, or rather, I didn't remember any dreams. Um, but I think I was always drawn to the ghosts and the supernatural and monsters, and it was just kind of
Mm.
it's in the blood, I think, really. Of
Yeah.
it's just one of those, you know, it's just one of the, I've always had been attracted to it. I think it's partly possibly because of having those nightmares. It's you want
Mm.
to understand being afraid, and that gives you a fascination with
Yeah.
it. And if you make fear your friend, it's rather than your enemy,
Oh,
sort of deal.
exactly. Exactly. And I think for me it was very similar. I also had the night terrors type thing. And but even today, if let's say I have anxiety dreams, which are usually about money
Mm,
or travel or something like that. And I find that when I wake up, well, I know it was a dream. It's not like the dream is still happening, but I find I'm worrying about the problem and figuring
yes,
out
there's
the
that strange
problem. Like,
hangover.
oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Or if you have an argument in a dream and you wake up and you're trying to win the argument. Well, I do anyway. But I think the notion of turning to horror stories to help deal with that fear is I wonder how many people actually do it because um, I think also I don't know if you remember Scooby Doo when it first came
Oh
out.
yes, yeah.
Yes, I think that has quite a powerful sort of way of dealing with it because you get presented with the scary things and in a comedy context, and then it turns out there was a human being all along. Which anyway, I'm getting a bit sort of diverted here.
On the
But
side, I
a
mean, I
very
know Scooby Doo's so familiar, but I mean, when it was on in the early 70s, when it was relatively
yeah.
new, the very first
Mm,
few seasons were really creepy as well as funny. Um,
yeah.
and later on, it got, I think, got softened from what it was. But certainly, I think I do remember watching Scooby Doo and sort of kind of the same way I watched Doctor Who. I was watching for a
Yes.
good scare, you know, and it's kind of, you know, it'll all be all right. That's the other thing. You know, by
Yes.
the end, everything will be wrapped up and normality, you know, peace and normality you will return. And so it's okay.
Mm,
You know what I mean? There's a definite cut-off point, and that I think that's quite important for children to have those sort of things. Um, you know, where things are scary, but you know they
yeah.
will be resolved by
Yes.
whatever means, and so that's it's a good life lesson to learn. If you got to, you know, hold your nerve sometimes and get through it, but things will do get better.
Yes, and as I think you also given a message in Scooby Doo that you face your fears, and it turns out they're not that scary after all. It I think a transition between child-friendly horrors and the adult horrors. But I got into the pan books of horror when I was about 10, and
Oh
those are
yes, yeah.
full on horrifying. How old were you when you discovered those?
Oh, probably about around the same age. It was definitely like in I'd have been third year junior school, and well, actually, probably the other. I remember seeing the covers. Um, at quite a young age, whenever my parents like, went to the big supermarket, we went to the big new like hypermarket thing called was it Argos, which was like a super Woolworths, and they had a book section. And rather than go around doing all the boring food shopping, I said, "Can I go look at the books?" I remember then wanting at the adult section and seeing all those marvelous covers they had for the Pan Book of Horror Stories,
Mm,
thinking, "What the hell are these about?" You know. But it was when, pretty much in my third year junior school that then kind of a friend of mine he picked up a copy second hand of I think the seventh Pan Book of Horror Stories, and that was like passed around like contraband of reading these absolutely shocking stories. I mean, a lot of them are still actually very the strong stuff. The really quite extreme. Some of the
yes.
stuff in there. Some really nasty stories. Actually, really, well, thinking about it.
Mm.
Dulcie Gray was one of my favorites in the Pan Book of Horror Stories.
Oh, good Lord. I'd
She
forgotten
she
all
wrote some
about her.
absolute shockers. Really frightening stuff, and really
I'll have to dig
gruesome
her
as
out.
well. Mm.
Is she public domain, do you know?
I'm not sure. Probably not. I know kind of there's a collected edition of stories, which I keep trying to track down, but the prices are now through the bloody roof. um,
Mm.
but she did quite a few great ones. The one I always remember, really bizarre one, was one called the brooch. So this woman gets this brooch, this like little furry animal, and actually through the course, it gets bigger and bigger and grows and comes to life, then eats her. Now that one was kind of
That sound
adapted.
reminds me of the Twilight Zone. Not the
Well, it
Twilight
was
Zone,
it was adapted
Night
into Night
Gallery.
Gallery. Yes, it was. Yeah, yeah. It
Yes.
was one of the few of her screen adaptations.
I have to dig her out. There was a lot of very good authors. I remember a lot of very good female authors like Mary Danby, Rosemary
Oh yes,
Timperley.
yeah. Mm,
Now, Celia Fremlin, who I think was best known for detective novels.
mm.
And yeah, yeah, you recorded a huge range of stories for your podcasts. And do you have an absolute favorite?
Ooh,
And is it by
I don't
M.R.
know.
James?
I know. Well, actually, although I love M.R. James, he's not actually my favorite to read and record. Um, um, uh, I particularly I like Pickman's Model by H.P. Lovecraft because that is a great one, a great story to record because it's all told
Yes.
unusually for Lovecraft, like a gentleman in a club telling a story. It's all like like a almost like a
Mm.
first person monologue. So that's a great one to do. Another favorite one of my all time favorite I've ever recorded was a story called "I Mars" by Ray Bradbury, about an astronaut
Oh,
who's
yes.
stranded on Mars, and everyone's gone back to Earth, but no one's coming back because there's been a war. And he basically sets up like
Oh,
these primitive, what we call AI versions of himself, tape because he has someone to talk to, and slowly
yeah.
they start driving him mad. And he literally almost
Ah,
seemingly conspiring against him. It's also called a Night Call Collect as well. There was a later revised version of it, but that's a great story. It's so fun because he's a man, see, like basically an audio hall of mirrors with these kind of artificial intelligence versions of him that seem to have well, quite happy to get rid of him because he's a bit of an inconvenience to their lifestyle.
yeah. There was an episode of Black Dwarf, no, not Black Dwarf, Red Dwarf, where Rimmer cloned himself. I wonder
Oh,
if
yeah,
that was
Rimmerworld,
inspired by it. Yes.
possibly because it is that kind of a. John Paul Sartre said, "Hell is the people," but I think actually hell will be stuck
Mm.
with different versions of yourself. I know Red Dwarf's explored that a few times because there's another episode where Rimmer rigs up the ship system to have two holograms of himself, and he thinks he's going to be great, and he won't be stuck with Slobby Lister. He'll have a companion that's just like him, and literally
Mm.
within in a week they're at each other's throats because it's all their foibles are magnified and
Yeah,
turned against each other. A lot of interesting stuff in Red Dwarf.
there certainly is. And I was reminded of one in which there was an alternative universe Rimmer, where he's a winner, where he's a lovely
Oh,
person and
yes,
everybody
yeah.
likes him. And that was because he was kept back at school and it made him toughen up or something.
That's right. Because the irony was that Ace Rimmer, the cool one, um, by the ordinary Rimmer standard, he was your ordinary Rimmer actually got the lucky break. He
Yeah,
didn't get kept back,
yeah,
but actually that was his undoing, really. If he had been kept
yes,
back, his life would have gone completely the opposite way. He'd become everything he wanted to be. It's a it's a marvelous
yeah.
little twist. There's lots of little nice twists in Red Dwarf. It reminds me a lot of kind of the Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch sort of twisting the tail, so little stingers to the stories.
That was it. Ace Rimmer, yes.
Mm.
Of course, it would mean something quite different nowadays, but at the time,
And for yes.
Ace Rimmer. Did you say you had a preference between science fiction or horror? Do you like one or the other more than the other?
I definitely prefer horror. I mean, I do like a fair bit of science fiction, um, but I think kind of there's something about horror fiction of where it's kind of a lot of horror is just kind of it's in our world, and you can get a lot more sort of commentary and that sort of uh, dark satirical sort of mirror held up. And also, I think when people write horror, I mean, even when they're not being very literary or making schlocky movies, quite by accident, they'll tap into something that's actually, weighing on people's minds or is a big fear in
Yeah,
society. It'll manifest. And I think there's kind of something very interesting the way the horror genre keeps doing that. And often it's by people who aren't intending to write something with a big subtext. They're often just trying to
mm,
make a book and scare the pants off some people. But
yes,
by
yeah,
accident, it just captures something. And I don't think you get quite the same thing in science fiction because there's a lot more. I think there's a lot more thought goes into science fiction.
yeah,
People are trying to predict the future. It's a more conscious, way of reflecting the present science fiction. Whereas horror operates on
yes,
this kind of like instinctive level, and it's amazing the
yeah,
number of times absolute hacks manage to get something that's actually very just really hits the mark, and it's why you
yeah,
get all these great horror movies and or cheap pot boiler novels that go through the roof because they just crystallize that
yes,
one fear that's in the ether at the time, and acts like a
Mm.
lightning rod, and people is drawn to it.
Yes, I suppose it's because as an author, you want to make a living, so you're going to write what you think will sell, and of course, it'll be, well, what are people really into at the moment? Oh, yes, that'll sell. But yeah, I think my own personal opinion is that when horror tries to be profound, it fails. But when they're just trying to scare the crap out of you, I think it works better that way. Would you agree?
Well, I think the great Ramsey Campbell, he was once asked about does he work out the subtext for his novels, and he says, "Well, no, I just really try and write what I think is scary, and I let my
Yeah,
subconscious worry about the subtext, and I'll trust it enough to get it right."
yeah,
And certainly
yeah,
when I write stories, I'm sort of trying to think of. I'm not thinking of, well, what does this symbolize? What does this mean? And
yeah,
to be honest, a lot of time I wouldn't really know because I'm really just trying to craft a story that'll
yeah.
work and and deliver, you know, what I wanted to deliver. I'm not really. I let other people worry about what it means.
Right now, I have to confess my ignorance because I didn't know that you were a writer as well. So, are
Well,
you?
like M.I. James, I dabble. Um,
Yeah,
I have a kind of a loose tradition. Usually every Christmas, I try and write and record a ghost story. I've done like 4 or 5 now, and I occasionally do one of my stories on the podcast. I've done quite a few where I've kind of actually sort of passed them off as kind of not passed them off, but sort of started out saying, "Well, this is something that happened to me," and um, sort of done it kind of as with me as the main character, and I'm telling you the story. Um, and then last year for Halloween,
yeah.
I had the idea of we can do an October Halloween advent calendar, and so I thought, well, I've got a few bits and bobs of like little pieces I've written that are very short. They're not long enough for a story. Can I put them all together? And it kind of, I ended up sort of what was going to be like quick fix up, just a bit of fun, turned into a larger project. I ended up kind of only using maybe a quarter of what I had planned and then rewriting fresh 3/4 of stuff. And it's basically kind of a story told in 31 parts of some are little
Yeah.
poems, some are kind of like fake big little articles, and then these other longer narratives from characters that all eventually you all piece together, and it all comes to a head on Halloween night in a and hopefully it's quite a scary end. It was, but I'm gonna not revise it. But I'm gonna do something else with that. Of
Yeah.
actually, I didn't intend to basically write a short novel, but I sort of did it by accident, as I do many things. It just once I saw the connections
Mm,
between a few little bits, and then I started just well, it was a story that had to be told, and hence
yeah.
Halloween morning, I was still up at 4 in the morning editing the last episode so it would go out at 9 o'clock Halloween day. But uh, yeah, it was got a bit stressful, but it was worth it. But I'm very,
And
very
you've
proud
got
of
to
that
have it
actually.
published. Yeah, right, quite rightly so. Have you ever thought of having it published as an ebook or even a physical book?
I'm sort of toying with the idea of getting it into shape because it's kind of
Mm,
it was done as a podcast, which meant as well as the kind of the recording of it, I did music for it as well. But it's also like I did a website version so you could read it, and that
yeah,
involved well, I need some pictures, so um, I'm still thinking well, I'm gonna have a look over the summer and try and see what I can format it into a book and see if it needs any
yeah,
extra bits. Because there's a couple of things I wanted to do, but I just didn't have time. Um, it's like there's two behind two of the doors. There's like song lyrics
yeah.
for songs that don't exist, but I kind of quite want to actually sort of make those songs, which I can probably get away with doing
Oh,
now with a bit more time. Um, and that'd be nice to have that sort of done as well, and maybe do some
yeah.
video for it. I don't know. There's a lot, lot of directions I could take it in, but it's up on my website hypnogoria.com, its own section as the Doors of October, and but I've got plans to do something a bit more with it and maybe and find out. I think if I format for a book, I'm gonna have to do some more do some more images, a bit more design work. But there's a as it's a story that is about a village where they've banned Halloween because of terrible things that happened there in the 1920s. There's a lot of fun to be had making like old photographs and old newspaper clippings and sort of supplemental stuff I didn't have time to do when I was doing it day by day last October. But yeah, I'll look at that over the summer, I think. But
Oh, absolutely. Have you thought of getting a collaborator, an artist, perhaps, or would you want to
it was
do
one
it
of
all
the kind of
yourself?
I'm a bit of a control freak, I must
Yeah.
admit. Um, but it's always that thing. Is kind of I'm very much a big believer of kind of not something control freakery, but it's kind of if you want something done,
Mm,
just do it, give it a go.
yes.
Um, you know what I mean? I'm pretty good with, I do have a background in art. I used to be a painter. I can
Yeah.
do digital manipulation and collages and all sorts. So it's kind of and watercolor. So I can work in
Mm,
a good variety of mediums where and so I've got on the website version, everything has a couple of illustrations or photographs, and it's kind of I could do a few more maybe if it needs it. But it's one of those the format to work on the page of a book rather than a web page and see how it all looks is that'll be just a matter of sort of doing a dummy document and sort of seeing what it needs, and
yes.
also how much it would cost to do things in color and stuff like
Oh,
that.
yes, there's always
But
that. Mind you, there's always
yeah,
Kickstarter, you know.
well, there is
Yeah.
that's a route I've sort of toying with the idea of I know there's a guy who's he's done a whole series of these like little self-published horror comics, Tom Burgess,
Yeah.
and he's done some really good little ghostly comics, but he's
Mm,
kickstarted all of those, and so it can be done, and but yeah, I have to finish the book first. See what it's going to
absolutely.
cost. Yeah.
The times of today is the resources that are available to creators are just beyond our wildest dreams, you know. So it's, I think it's just not so long ago we would be entirely dependent upon corporations and large publishers to get things done, and and to
And
make
also just
little
knowing
movies.
the right people
Mm.
to get things done. I mean,
Oh yes,
particularly in the arts, if you're not really in London, you know, or Manchester, maybe, or Liverpool at a pinch, or Edinburgh, forget it. You know what I mean? You will have to move to one of those big places to get a foot in the door and know the right people. That's how it
yeah,
used to be. The internet and technology has been a great equalizer in that regard, and it is great that um, I don't know. He's very punk rock, I think. That
yes,
do-it-yourself sort of spirit, and certainly that's what drew me
yeah,
initially to podcasting because it was very much kind of this is ordinary people talking about their passions. It's
mm,
not been filtered by a market demographics or
mm,
from people who have been too long in the field and have got very jaded and tired. Which having been reviewing things for quite a few years, I do understand why mainstream critics can get like that. But I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, I never thought I'd be or have the equipment to literally, be able to do my own radio show
yeah,
effectively with your podcast. I never thought I'd literally have, well, on the laptop, I'm talking to you, a whole music
mm,
studio and be able to make music.
yeah,
Considering I'm not musical at all, I had music lessons as a kid and it didn't stick.
mm,
But literally, only from when I turned 50 a few years ago, I decided my midlife crisis was to finally to learn to get a synthesizer and learn to play it because that's what I wanted
yeah,
to do. And I was 10 and 11, and first getting into
mm,
music. And I loved all the synthesizer bands. And I was like, no, I'm not good enough. I can't play piano. I tried, it doesn't work. I thought, no, sod it.
uh,
I'm going to do that. My wife said, "No, you should do that." And and so now I'm doing all music for all the readings I do as well, and it's kind of completely self-taught, and I'm having a whale of a time. But it's incredible. You can do these things. Everyone complains, saying, "Oh, the future's rubbish. Where are the robots? Where are the flying cars?" Forget that. You can make an album on a
Don't
cheap
need those.
laptop for,
Don't
you know,
need those.
you can make a
Oh, I
movie.
remember
You can
very
do anything
much,
you want.
yeah, wanting to buy a little Wasp synthesizer when I was 19, 18, sorry. And my mother, God bless her, wouldn't stand credit for me, so she wouldn't back me up. So bang went my musical career. But that you've brought back the sort of spirit of punk rock, because I remember working on these little punk rock fanzines, and we would literally, I worked in an office, we'd literally run off a few copies on the office copier, which I probably shouldn't be saying, but hey, they're probably all dead by now. That's one of the great things of
Well,
punk
no,
rock.
but we did that. I mean, when I was in sixth form college, we did a role-playing fanzine and a poetry one, and we were very much abusing the
Mm,
facilities. In the end, we did stuff up to actually get them like printed and lost money doing it, but it was all fun, you know what I mean? But um, it's like it's very important, I think, that sort of fan
mm,
scene is kind of so I'm very interested in pop culture and
yeah,
fan culture, and on my show when I'm talking about things, I'm really sort of doing a deep dig into the context of the times, and it's interesting.
yeah,
No matter what you're talking about, it's kind of increasing. You find the people who are making stuff now are people who were
yeah,
fans and they got started doing fanzines or dabbling here and there. You know what I mean? And it's kind of that's where the creators come from people just getting involved, having a go at even just the smallest local level. And um, I think certainly currently there's now so much stuff out there from small creators, and being in a small press isn't an obscure thing, because now there's that many publishing houses, even the big
oh yes,
old, they're small presses as well, really, now in the landscape. They're just one more name
yeah,
in a huge range of stuff out there.
yes. And I think on the one hand, I mean, talent has now been unleashed. Is that you no longer have to have the contacts, you no longer have to have large amounts of money. But there's such a proliferation that I don't want to describe anybody's work as dross, because once you start to appreciate the amount of work that goes into it, um, but at the same time, you have to sift through an awful lot of poor quality stuff to find the good quality stuff. What
Mm.
criteria do you have when, like, if you were looking for something new to read or to learn? What sort of filtering criteria would you use?
Well, actually, I know, I feel a bit bad saying it, but it's kind of I very much use the William Burroughs, naked lunch sort of principle, where you have a good look at what's on the end of the fork. And the first bite, they say, is with the eye. And say if I'm looking to, whether it's a small movie or a book or a record or whatever, if the cover design doesn't look good enough, I'm instantly wary.
Yeah,
Um, it's not a deal breaker, because obviously um, getting good designers and good artists, it's tough and it costs money, or you have to be very talented or know or be lucky enough to know someone very talented. And I've read some amazing books that had terrible covers, and likewise seen some
yeah,
amazing films that had crappy posters. But that's the first. If you can get over that hurdle of, look, I don't have to like it, but it has to look
mm,
professional, or you know what I mean, or have an energy to it. I mean, kind of like a lot of like the early
yeah,
punk sleeves did. You know what I mean? It's kind of, they weren't done by professional designers, but there was a raw, create. You could see the creativity bursting at the seams. You don't have to be
mm,
polished. And sometimes rough and raw is better. You know what I mean, and that, 'cause it makes you stand out. Certainly, I mean, these days, I mean, if you go into a mainstream bookstore, it's kind of the cover art is so poor now. It's just really just a lot of typeface,
Wow.
two colors, a little image, and it's kind of, oh no, this is just rubbish. This isn't the lurid covers I grew up with that promised the world,
Mm,
literally, or showed you new worlds just on the cover. Or
yeah. Do you think there was a golden age of cover art? Because I'd plump for the 80s if it was me, but what would you think? What would you
I
say?
think, yeah, probably the 80s was the golden age for both like film design, record sleeves,
Mm,
and book covers. And I think they just had it to a fine art then of there's some good stuff in the 70s, but it's kind of, I think it was in the 80s all crystallized, and it was the kind of just like,
mm,
wow, you get some really iconic
yeah,
images and iconic covers. I mean, even some really, really crappy books had amazing covers. Like
yeah.
one of my favorites was by Pierce Nace, "Eat Them Alive," which had a marvelous cover of a killer praying mantis slathered in blood, just leering out the camera at you. And it's a terrible
Fun
book.
stuff.
It's one of the grossest books I've ever read. Just,
Oh,
just really kind of what they call torture porn, with a ludicrous
yeah.
plot about a very nasty man in a very nasty gang gets double crossed, tortured to left for dead. He survives, and he goes to a desert island. A volcano explodes, and giant praying mantises come out, who he tames and then takes back to America and hunts down his former gang mates. And there's long descriptions of how the mantis eat everybody and tear them apart. It's absolute
Any
nonsense and
explanation
vile.
of how he gets them through customs?
The old mantra of "shut up." That's why I think it's absolute nonsense. I mean, what giant praying mantises are doing in a live volcano anyway? Who knows? But it's again
Just
now
resting.
quite highly sought that
Oh, I don't
paperback.
believe this.
Legendarily terrible.
Sorry, I'm getting phone calls. Oh Lord. Jim, I'm going to ask the question that my friend Kat Pulver has asked. It says, could you ask Jim if he has a favorite cover artist and comic book artist, possibly?
Ooh, that's a good one. In comics, it's definitely Brian Bolland. Um, it was just phenomenally good artist, and even more so when you realise he did it all with a brush, not a pen. uh, I'm very, very fond of the George Underwood paintings for the first 5 Necroscope books by Brian Lumley.
Yes.
They were really iconic with these sort of variations on scary skulls, but by the fourth and fifth one, they become these like weird, like Baroque three-dimensional sculptures, kind of not really Geiger-esque, but kind of like stained glass windows with skulls, and they're kind of wonderfully bizarre.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, my own favorite
Les
is Ian
Edwards as
Miller
well,
and the
actually.
Lovecraft ones. Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah, the Haunter of the Dark, the Panther Haunter of the Dark.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great cover. Um,
Mm.
and I posted that on Twitter recently. I always put a book cover up or a post film post every morning, and quite a few people said of that one said that is just such a Lovecraftian image. It's probably
Mm.
nearly the perfect distillation of Lovecraft in an image, and it is a fantastic bit of work. Uh, so somehow redolent of kind of the old pulp illustrations, and yet also very psychedelic, and also like looking like nothing on earth, like which Ian Miller's very good at. Kind of, he's got a window into
Yeah.
his own beautifully intricate but strangely terrifying world.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the Necroscope books because I've noticed you've done some recent podcasts on Brian Lumley. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, basically, I mean, I sort of grew up reading Brian Lumley books. I mean, it's another early classic collection I got was a book for children by from the Piccolo called The Gruesome Book, edited by
Mm.
Ramsey Campbell, and a very brief introduction by Ramsey said, "I remember getting books for of ghost stories for children, and they wouldn't have scared anyone. So here's my attempt at one that's full of really scary stories." And it has some great stories in, like The Graveyard Rats by Henry Kuttner, and but it has The Deep Sea Conch by Brian Lumley, which is a fantastically frightening and bizarre story. And after that, I was hooked, and I found out he was writing sort of Lovecraftian stuff. And at that time, I just discovered Lovecraft, and it was just at the right time when he had a really good paperback deal, and kind of a Necroscope had come out, and that was kind of like shot him into the stratosphere. And then all these books were out. So there was every month there was a new Lumley paperback for a while, and there's a whole shelf of them. He was there between kind of King and Kuntz and Ran Rice, a big Brian Lumley section. But yes, when I heard he'd sort of passed away in January, he was kind of, I've got to do a show on him now, and I can't let that pass unremarked. And so, and it turned, as many of my shows do, it turned out far longer than I initially intended. So it was 2 very long shows, basically just going through his whole life and career and telling his story, and which is kind of a want to give him a good send off. And I'm quite pleased that a lot of people got in touch and said, "Oh, I've not really read anyway. I am going to now." And it's kind of so almost envious, you've got such great stories ahead of you, which, I remember reading for the first time. And because no one wrote like Brian did. He had a very unique
No, he a unique style. Yes.
yeah, and he was just not afraid of anyone else would go, "Oh, that sounds going a bit too over the top. That's a bit too weird. You can't mix those genres together." Brian would be like, "Oh, bollocks, you can. Come on, let's go." And it was always such tremendous fun, and he has and such a warmth to his books. And I know certainly from doing the shows, a lot of people got in touch, saying kind of how much his books meant to them, and I know in interviews he said, his job, he said, was to entertain his readers and have fun doing it, and he certainly had done that. And so I'm quite pleased that the 2 shows I did have sort of, well, gave him a round of applause as he goes off to join the great majority, as he put it.
Yeah. Did you ever meet him?
No, sadly not. I do have a signed copy of a little small press book he did back in the 80s, Synchronicity or something. That's as close as I got to meeting. I've got his signature.
Hey, yes, I met him several times. I remember initially being terrified of him because he had this very strong. He'd been a military policeman,
Yeah.
and that means he has to terrify drunken soldiers. And when he was back in civilian life, he hadn't quite dropped the demeanor as but I soon found, that he was actually an extremely kind and generous person. Didn't like to be thanked, but it was
Yeah.
there. Well, as a completely different change of tack, you've done a history of Universal Horror, which is now on to part 31.
Yes, it's going to run to part 34. I've actually just
Mm-hmm.
I've got the last 2 episodes last 2 coming out. But yes, I only meant to do a brief overview, but it kind of grew and grew and grew, and the more I dug into it. So originally I thought I want to do kind of an overview, and then I can do. I've already done a series on the Wolfman. I've already done the Mummy films. I've done Creature from the Black Lagoon, but I want to do Frankenstein, I want to do Dracula, and some of the others. And I thought, well, probably the best way if I do an overarching history of Universal, then I can slot these other series sort of in and tie them together. And it just, I kind of found there was more Universal horror than I realised. And it would, I say, been a few years work on and off, but been tremendously rewarding because it's been I've actually got to track down a lot of very obscure films that are kind of outside the main famous monsters. And
Name one. Name one that
oh,
you
there's
might
some
not have heard
great
of.
ones like that. one I really was impressed with, one called Night Key, starring Boris Karloff, which is kind of like a
Uh-huh.
dark, almost science fiction thriller. And it's about a scientist who comes up with this unique security system and then gets ripped off. But because he can get back into the system, he can take his revenge, which he does. And it's kind of like a weird sort of noir science fiction. It's kind of like the first
Mm-hmm.
hacking movie before anyone knew what hacking was or even thought of hacking, the idea of hacking. But essentially, that's what it is. There's another good one called The
Making a
Mad
note of
Ghoul
this.
as well. Yeah. Another
Oh no,
favorite
I
was The
think I
Mad
saw that one.
Ghoul
Was
with.
that the one where he took his teeth out to give his jaw this distorted shape?
No,
Or
no, this is
was that
not. Karloff's not in that one. This is George Zuko, who's uh, a scientist who's investigating voodoo and yeah, it's voodoo, voodoo rituals. And he has this drug, and he finds out the secret of zombification, which he uses on one of his students, and basically has this guy with who can turn into this sort of effectively, this controllable zombie, complete looking like a zombie,
mm,
like decomposed, effectively dead but alive and under Zuko's control, and uses him to go and bump people off. But um, as often is the case with these things, he needs regular top ups so that can only be got from
oh yeah.
harvesting human glands. But that's a great movie. It's really interesting because it is kind of Zuko's kind of effectively he's stalking a younger woman
Mm,
who's obsessed with, and she's a singer on tour, and so it's kind of these random murders are cropping up wherever she's on tour because he's following her, trying to get close to
right.
her.
Oh, this sounds like well the kind of movie where she ends up marrying the policeman who's investigating the murders to or am I just putting that out of the air?
It's close. No, she's got her own bow though. But there's a doggy detective who's really good. He's trying to get to the bottom of this very bizarre case, and I say quite good old fashioned flatfoot police work. A lot of pounding the streets, asking questions, knocking on doors, taking names. Uh, no, it's a really sort of fun sort of. It's kind of like it's a very different take on the traditional sort of voodoo zombie story. It's got this more like science fiction twist, but it's also like very noir as well because it is like a this murder mystery of this string of bizarre serial killings and
Yeah.
grave robbings where they're getting the glands to keep him going. But yeah, there's so lots
Yes,
of really good little interesting movies that don't feature say Dracula or Frankenstein and
yeah.
or even
And
any of the big
there's
horror
a lot.
stars.
Yeah, be a lot for people to dig out. I'm definitely going to have a look up for Night Key once this closes. Now, to a complete change of tone, you've got this commentary club that you present,
Oh yes.
and I cannot help but be absolutely intrigued by crap films. You've got Sharknado, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, The Manster, Howard the Duck.
Yeah, oh, that's
Sounds
probably one of the worst we've done.
really
I'd say that the commentary was an
sounds of
idea.
interest
I'd done a
to me.
few. Yeah, I'd done a few commentaries before on my own, and
Mm,
basically, so I decided I wanted to do a show with my wife Teresa.
mm.
Because kind of doing a film commentary on your own is a bit difficult. Trying to keep talking and talking and talking. And so did commentary club really is kind of like a bit of fun, and we also have we're trying to raise a bit of money for an Alzheimer's charity which her late mother had,
Yeah,
and we said, well, how are we going to do this? We said we came up with the idea we'd each take turns picking a film, but we'd have like a
yeah.
cycle. We do a classic film one week, a cult film
Mm,
for the next episode, then a crap film. um, and I think it's the crap films I've enjoyed doing the most actually because we've seen
yes.
some very bizarre films indeed. Um, some have been absolutely shocking, and either one of us or both have been just shouting and abuse at the screen. But quite often we've seen some really strange little films, like the New Zealand one called Killer Sofa, which is about
Oh,
a sofa possessed by an evil spirit. But it's really funny and it's really clever, and it's kind of a little sort of, again, like a punk rock vibe to it. And the
Yeah.
way they got a particular sofa and the way they shoot it with the buttons, so the buttons look like evil eyes glaring at people, it's just hilarious. And um, it's a really sort of interesting little film, made for tuppence, but had a lot of heart. It was, really good fun. We were surprised. But
Yeah.
we couldn't resist a film called Killer Sofa.
Oh, it's even more fetching than killer tomatoes or tomatoes. I'm surprised that Night of the Lepus didn't make that list. You seen that one?
Oh yeah, several
The
times.
giant rabbit.
Oh no, I mean, um, the thing with Comedy Club, we always do it so the films are actually currently on streaming, so people can watch along.
Ah,
And so when Night of the Lepus comes on streaming, it will get done, and hopefully it'll coincide
good.
with Easter, because we do
Oh,
sort of, as well as
absolutely.
we do a seasonal specials, which are normally hideously inappropriate. Like the first Easter
Mm.
special, we did The Life of Brian. Uh, and
Well, that definitely isn't under the crap films, I'm sure it.
no, but well, the seasonal specials, you kind of, they're just a film we think would be funny to do for that particular holiday. And so the Valentine's one, we've done things like Dell'Amore and Hellraiser, another great romantic film.
Hellraiser, how is it romantic?
Well, it's kind of a love story between Frank and Julia, sort of.
Huh. Yes, I suppose you could say that. Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Oh dear. And let's see, Ice Spiders. Now, I was rather intending to watch that one. Why does that one count as a crap film?
Oh, it was shocking. Well, but often with the crap films, it's a case of we're looking for something with very poor reviews. And sometimes,
Mm,
well, with all the films we choose, sometimes we've seen them, sometimes we haven't. And sometimes it is kind of,
mm.
especially with the crap films, we're picking something, I say something that just sounds like, well, it's called Apocalypse Clown. We've got to watch this. It might be
All
rubbish,
right.
but that's why we have this section. Um, so Ice Spiders was kind of had very bad reviews, and it kind of there's going to be one of these films that got really cheap effects, and indeed it
Yeah.
has.
Ah, yeah.
I mean, it's quite gloriously bad. He's really we was that was one we had a lot of fun doing that one because the effects are so shonky and the plot is so
Yeah.
ridiculous. It's so silly. You know what I mean? You can just we always say what makes a really truly bad film is if it's boring.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
However, you can be absolutely rubbish, but if you're entertaining, that's fine. If you show me something I've
Yeah.
never seen before, even better. And some really bad low budget films, they can achieve that quite easily, and usually
Yeah.
not too long, so they don't outstay their welcome. However, I mean, another film we did that's got bad reviews
Yeah.
that had a lot of money and big stars was The Ice Road with Neil Neeson, which is just dumb as a bag of rocks. And makes no sense whatsoever, and it's just a complete waste of everyone's time and talent. And it had millions of dollars behind it. There's no excuse for this
Mm,
nonsense script they started with. I quite like dumb movies, but
yeah.
you got to join the dots and be dumb in the right way. You know what I mean? It's kind of there's good crazy and there's bad crazy in
Yeah.
films, and this is a case of kind of you're trying to make out this sort of ridiculous plot of kind of these guys trapped in a mine. Okay, the mine appeared to be the size of a small apartment complex, and it's kind of they're not going to run out of air anytime soon. There's no claustrophobia. And they literally,
Yeah.
in the movie, they've been down there about 3 hours and they're already talking about cannibalism. It's like, guys, come on. It's a bit soon for that. Well, I think I was probably most annoyed when I was watching that one. I was really annoyed.
Mm.
Was. Um,
What would you
but
say was the
that's the fun of
worst?
doing these
Yeah.
things. Mm?
What would you
So you
say
go
was
on.
the worst movie you'd ever seen?
Oh, worst movie I've ever seen. Ooh. Um, probably a very obscure film called was it Wrong Turn or Wrong?
Oh, yes,
It's not.
yes.
It's not
I
the
think
one
it's got a
from.
cult following, hasn't it?
Oh, it's not. It's not that one. It's one from the early 70s,
Oh.
and I watched it because it's actually on the Section 3 video nasty list, and we were what
Mm-hmm.
I was there's a podcast I used to listen to, the Strange and Deadly show, and they were going through all the Section C list of the video nasties, which is all kind of, it's not the famous ones. It's kind of the last sort of trangs that are added, and they had some very bizarre films on there. Quite a few films that didn't deserve to be on there, just on there because they had a lurid cover or a stupid title. It was an interesting show because you got a very weird mix of films. And but the worst, it was called Wrong Turn. It was sort of like 72, 73. It's like female hitchhikers who get picked up by these seedy hippies, then basically assaulted for half an hour. They escape, and then they get picked up by a Charles Mansonist death cult. And there's more just gratuitous nastiness. And
As you do, yeah.
it was meant to be, I think it was trying to be pornography, but it was just sleazy and
Mm.
nasty and just kind of like really just, I mean, I'm not a prude, but just kind of unpleasant sex scenes. I've got to like
Yeah.
kind of, oh, this is really skeevy. Couldn't you add a wash? Oh, it's just, and just generally framed in the context of basically, rape and assault was just very, it's really just kind of, this is a wretched film. It doesn't
Yeah.
work as a horror film. It doesn't work as a film. It doesn't really work as pornography. It's just horrible. You know what I mean? On every level. And that's probably the worst thing
Yeah.
I've sat through. Um, but very, very little known, thankfully, and long may it
Mm.
stay that way.
Well, to take the nasty taste out of your mouth, what would you say was the best?
Ooh, that's tough. Um, I mean, still a huge admirer of The Haunting by Robert Wise. I think that's
Yes.
just a masterclass in movie making. It's and it's one of the strangely almost like a film outside time. It hasn't really dated. I know now it is obviously a period piece, but because it's all just in Hill House, and Hill House is this old, no one's lived there for years. That's trapped in time. So the film has as well. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They could have been come from any era, those characters. And I think there's so many different layers to it. And the characters are kind of, even still, they don't come across as being dated as 50
Yeah.
stereotypes. They come across as real people. And that, again,
Yes. Yes.
it still works. I mean, when I first watched it, I had no idea really what year it was made. I thought
Mm.
it might be old because it's black and white, or it might be old, or it might be black and white because it's arty. I couldn't tell. But you know what I mean? I was quite surprised when I found out it was, actually the date it was made, because it all felt a lot more contemporary, because felt really cutting
Mm.
edge, and it still feels cutting edge. And
Oh,
there's
yes.
so many just great moments where you find you're terrified by looking at an ornament, just a shot
Yes.
panning across a mantelpiece, and it's terrifying. It's kind of that's
Yes.
impressive.
That is indeed. That is indeed. Yes, I think I might agree actually. Though Angel Heart might
Oh,
also be the best. I'm not sure.
that's a very good movie as well. It's a lovely puzzle box of a film with a. I still remember the first time I saw it and getting towards the end, going, "Oh my god!" It's that kind of, when the pennies start to drop and you realize what's
Oh
happening.
yes.
It's kind of, that's a really good kind of moment.
Mm. And I found because of it, it's one of the rare films that is scarier the second time than it was the first, which I think
Well,
is
I think the
really
Angel
different.
Heart, once you know how it ends and you're watching it, you
Mm.
start, you go, "Oh, hang on, oh no, oh." Everything has an added
Yeah.
resonance. I think that the Blair Witch Project's like that as well. For
Yeah.
me, there's a great scare in it that I didn't realize was a scare until the second time round.
Mm.
And it's where in the last act they find a house in the woods. And it's only when I was
Yeah.
watching it the second time and I've been sort of processing all the clues, I realized that house isn't there. That house is a ghost. It's Rustin Parr's house that burnt down years ago.
Oh,
It shouldn't be there. And that was kind of like, I was like, oh my Lord, that's terrifying.
I'm going to have to
Um,
watch that one again
yeah. The
because
house,
I didn't realize that.
yeah. The house burnt
I
down
didn't
in
realize
was
that.
burnt down after he was arrested in some in 1960 or something. And so that house itself
Oh,
is a ghost. And it's kind of the second I watched it, I was
oh.
like, oh Christ, that was a good jolt.
Right. Well, I'm starting to wind the podcast down now, but before we sort of finish it, do tell us about what you have in the pipeline for us.
Well, so soon I'll be finishing off the history of Universal horror. Um, After that, my next project, I'm going to do a history of the origins of kaiju movies.
All right.
As I say, Godzilla minus one is currently being hailed left, right, and centre. Even won an Oscar, and we've got Kong X Godzilla: The New Kingdom coming out as well. So that was a good time to delve into the history and the family tree of kaiju movies, because there's an awful lot of interesting connections, and uh, I found some amazing stuff of how far back it goes. Um, and so there's some really interesting stuff. Like sadly some of it's lost, but like one of the earliest kaiju movies involved a statue of the Buddha coming to life and running amok.
Whoa.
Yeah, so there's
Have
lots
to
of
see
fun
that
stuff.
one
So
first.
no, it's a lot lost, I'm afraid. So that's from about 23, 1923, a
Mm,
Japanese film. There's also like two silent Japanese King Kongs that are lost as well.
all
Um,
right.
yeah, there's and I found a very, very bizarre early story about a surviving dinosaur that has a very bonkers end, which I think I'm going to read um, on my reading show to tie in with it, because that'd be a lot of fun. I think it's a strange
Right.
story. But yes, other than that, I've sort of, I'm going to do a few years ago, I was doing a series about zombies before George Romero,
Yeah.
um, which I've been meaning to get back
Traditional
to. I'm going to
zombies.
finally,
Mm,
yeah, finally going to get back to that, and but that'll tie into as well doing a kind of a complementary series to go with the Universal horror, looking
yeah.
at the films of Val Lewton. And
Mm,
I also want to do a little series based on an obscure British horror movie studio that's sort of been lost in the mix, really. Back in the day, we know there was Hammer films, and Hammer begat Amicus and Tygon movies. However, there's also another group called Tempean Films, who, like Amicus, used to poach Hammer's talent.
uh-huh.
And they did a series of horror movies, which are kind of quite overlooked, but all quite interesting. And they're very much kind of like historical horror. They did like one on the Hellfire Club, and another one on Burke and Hare, and another on Jack the Ripper. Well, they often had like Peter Cushing or a script by Jimmy Sangster and things like that. And they're really good, entertaining horror movies, but they seem to be almost like completely overshadowed by Hammer and Amicus. So I go, I can try and redress that balance and fill in a missing chapter of British horror history.
Have you ever thought to do anything about Todd Slaughter?
Yes, I have actually. I mean, I'd read about Todd Slaughter for years, but not been
Yeah.
able to see any of his movies. And Channel 4 did a season of Todd Slaughter films in the end of the 80s, but they've been very hard to get hold of. But recently, quite a few have been turning up on Amazon Prime. And I kind of do,
Right.
again, I've got kind of a
Probably on
larger,
YouTube.
yeah, I've got a larger sort of idea of doing a history of British horror films, because there's lots of interesting British
Mm,
horror outside of Hammer and Amicus. In particular, before then,
yeah.
that's kind of in the traditional histories, the British horror is The Dead of Night, then Quatermass
Yes.
Experiment, then Hammer, then Amicus, and that's your lot. But there's actually a ton of interesting stuff was going on in the 40s and the 50s, and lots of interesting movies. And I definitely want to cover Todd Slaughter, because I'm a huge fan of his
The
Sweeney
name
Todd.
alone.
I know. He was such a brilliant performer.
Oh
No
yes,
scene was safe from being chewed, but he's so fun to watch. He's
he's so
such a
fun
good
to watch.
villain.
But
Mm,
in the murder in the red barn, there's a scene where he's forced to dig up the barn,
mm,
and where he's buried his victim. And I remember suddenly being struck that he actually was a very scary performer,
mm.
but he was too busy chewing the scenery to be able to really make use of it. It's like when he became a naturalistic performer, and I felt he suddenly
Yeah.
became very naturalistic in that scene. He was actually very frightening indeed.
I
And
can't remember another one of his movies
I
where
do.
he plays basically a high functioning psychopath and he's swindling everybody.
Mm,
In that, there's moments where he's like, you get this genuine kind of creepiness of kind of like, God, really is a psychopath. He's a proper narcissist or a sociopath.
mm,
And he, you know what I mean? He does not care a jot about anyone else. And that really kind of
yeah.
frightening intensity. There's kind of
Mm,
quite small moments rather than these normal big, ha ha ha, mustache
yes.
twirling
Yes.
kind of. But there's yeah, it was interesting. So interesting and much overlooked. I think I definitely do want to do Todd Slaughter at some stage and say shine a light. I like digging up these bits of horror history and sort of
Mm,
piecing things together because nothing comes from nothing, if you know what I mean. Like Hammer films didn't
yes.
pop out, out of nowhere. They
Yeah.
were drawing on existing traditions, and there is a strong British horror tradition. Our take is very different to the American horror film, and it's
Yeah.
but yeah, I've been tracking down lots of odd films and watching them, and just letting it all percolate in my brain. And at some point, it'll come out as a series or several series probably. Because
It's a
in British
shame,
horror, I
that we
noticed
can't. Yeah.
sorry, go on.
It's a shame that we can't go back in time and see some of the Victorian melodramas on the stage, which I think heavily influenced the Todd Slaughter movies.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I know from doing the history of Universal horror, and from my own research into the early British horror, the number of even early 50s, a lot of the kind of
Yeah.
chillers were based either they're adaptations or outright rip-offs of things from the 1890s stage productions that were now all completely forgotten. But from what I've read, is kind of they were hugely elaborate, and it's kind of we wouldn't have Lugosi Dracula without Hamilton Dean's stage Dracula. Uh,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? There's kind of it's a whole like sort of forgotten area, and certainly I know the stagecraft had got they could pull off some quite impressive special effects on the stage, and
Mm,
really, it was very much more cinematic than we think theatre would be. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it would be. I'd love to be able to go back and see sample sample some shows from the time because they had a lot of kind of the special effects we use were developed for the stage.
Yeah.
Even now.
Yeah. Would you think of yourself as a historian?
Um, Probably. I'm sort of when I started out. Well, I started before I was doing the podcast. I was doing a blog and just writing like little reviews, and I kind of found I don't really like doing reviews per se, um, because often you're talking about something that's just come out and you've not had time to really process it. And but when I was sort of reviewing older things, you start digging into kind of what did people at the time think of it? What else was big at the time? What was this
Yeah.
influenced by? How did this fit in? I found that's kind of as interesting as talking as reviewing the film, and kind of that
Yeah.
sort of. I think in my show is quite early on when I did a couple of episodes on some great favourites of mine, the Doctor Fives films. I
Yeah.
found it was digging into all the lore and the history and finding out of what was planned, what happened, what didn't happen. That kind of
Mm,
changed my trajectory from moving away from reviewing to becoming more
yeah.
like taking a historical approach, basically. and that opened up the format as well, because I'm not just reviewing things, and so I could do, say, just bits on folklore or anything weird and wonderful that uh, would interest me, and so I do sort of. I still often get lots of stuff. People ask me to review things. Kind of, I don't really want to. It's not. That's not really where the show is. It's not really what I do. It's
Yeah.
I am, doing horror, doing the history of the weird and the macabre, in basically, and it's kind of
Yeah.
um, I should transcribe these into books at some point, really.
I hope so. I hope
Mm.
so. I mean, I asked you because just always been. Firstly, you're probably one of the first people I became aware of when I came on the internet. Secondly, because I do love your voice. It's a joy to listen to. But because I'm seriously impressed by the huge amount of work you do and the breadth of what you cover, but just such a contribution to the history of movies, of books, of comics, of horrible old tat, things I've never heard of. And I want to thank you very much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Oh, it's been an
And
absolute
do you have
pleasure.
any final? Oh, thank you. And is there anything in particular you'd like to promote to the audience whilst they're here?
Well, basically, you can find nearly everything I do is on my website, hypnogoria.com, where you can find all the podcasts and also a good many articles as well, of which some of which have become podcasts, some of which haven't, some of which should do when I get around to them. But yeah, everything I do is kind of there, and uh, I try and keep on top of it and keep it updated regularly. So I've got a backlog of things to still to go on, but it's
Yeah.
finding the time, and as a trouble having diverse interests,
Mm.
I need like several diverse timelines to do everything I'm trying to do at
Yeah.
once. But uh, it's all, the show goes on. It all gets done in the end.
Gets done in the end. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for coming on. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for watching, for listening, for your comments. And all right, I'm going to switch off. Next week, I hope to have an Italian actor, but you never know. He might be busy. So thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Good night, folks.